Before I get into this video, I just want people to realize exactly what it is. I'm not going through every event or influential person in Scottish history. In fact, I'm not touching on most of them. I'm focusing on the larger cultural shifts, what influenced the Scots, and how they attained such elevation in the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution. As with any true examination of a culture, there are a lot of factors to consider, and so the philosophical explanation for the Scottish dominance gets rather dense, but I think that I'll be explaining everything well enough where people can follow. If something seems confusing or you miss something, I'll likely explain it again in a different way very soon after, so please don't feel as if you need to fit every sentence that I say into some grand puzzle. I'll regularly go back and set the pieces in place. So I hope that you enjoyed this exposition on Scottish history and their inevitable dominance. One question that has explicitly been met with confusion by most historians is how the Scottish people went from living in filth with animals while the Romans were building dams and flushing toilets, to then dominating the world in medicine, applied science, education, economics, philosophy, and much more by the end of the Industrial Revolution. To have the advancements that they did once they were open to the rest of the world necessarily means that there was something powerful about the Scots, and it seems to be extraordinarily unique, both in quantity and quality. Now, I should mention that I've noticed something about modern writers that seems to contaminate almost everything that they touch, and that's the implication that what they consider good and bad is concrete, and that good is the highest concept. Often we see historians refer to the pre-industrial Scots as crude and malevolent brutes. Then miraculously they just jump to the top of the ladder. This alone begs the question, did those who study the Scots properly understand them? It's one thing to study history. It's quite another to understand human action and then study history as a means of connecting the world through time. So that's what I've set out to do for you today. When it comes to the Scottish people, one thing to keep in mind is that, as with most early wafts of society, geographical barriers heavily influence cultural divides. In Scotland, there was a line to be drawn between the Highland Scots and the Lowland Scots. So as I go through the history, I'll be mentioning where these cultures differed, but I'll largely be going through this as chronologically as I think is necessary. Now, one of the points of interest for a lot of people with the Scots is the fact that the Scots were never subdued by the Romans. They thought that it would be relatively easy to do, but due to the abject poverty and brutality of the Scottish tribes, they decided against it. There was little to be made off of taxation, but there was much to be lost in terms of warriors and other various resources. Not to mention the constant attention that would have to be paid to the Scots to retain rule over them. Because of this, there is very little that's known about the Scots during the Roman occupation of Britain. And the first Brit didn't even enter the history books until Julius Caesar's raiding expedition along the British coast in 55 BC. At that time, Britain was very underdeveloped compared to the Romans. This led to them easily being conquered by the Romans, despite the British massively outnumbering them. Under Roman rule, Britain continued to be one of the most underdeveloped provinces, but economically, culturally, and socially, the Brits leapt forward thanks to the Romans. But once the Romans left 4 centuries later, Britain retrogressed because the society was too complex, too advanced, too economically independent, and really too indefensible for the British people to support. During this 4th century occupation of advanced order, there were some Germanic tribes that began to flow into Britain, and some came after Roman occupation in the 5th century as military allies to help repel other British tribes that were ancestors of today's Irish and Scots. The Romans were primarily Mediterranean, and there was also a cultural influence imparted by Germanic tribes. Today, we refer to those Germanic tribes as Anglo-Saxons. Then came the influence of the Normans after the Norman conquest of Britain in the 11th century. This Mediterranean, Germanic, and Norman influence belatedly seeped into Scotland as the Scottish remained on the fringes of European civilization culturally, economically, politically, and of course geographically. Those specific aspects of a society are not distinctly separated. For example, the geography massively affects the external influences on a people that will serve to cultivate a culture. Politics is then downstream from culture, and you can see how economics ties into all of that. But to get back to my main point here, the Scots were behind the English after Roman occupation, and even further behind during Roman occupation. To put it in perspective, up into the early 1600s, Scotland was still using primitive farming implements like those used by the ancient Mesopotamians. So the Scots were basically using farming tools that were between 5,000 and 7,000 years old. Now, up into the early 14th century, Scotland lacked any unified political order that would unite the nation under a common rule of law. Often, local barons would develop their own laws, and clan warfare kept Scotland in turmoil and disarray. The border regions between Scotland and England were particularly insecure because the Scots would regularly raid English settlements for people, livestock, food, etc. In terms of fluctuating law, the border region was particularly variant because it was heavily occupied by marauders who would flout the authority of both countries with no real allegiance to any specific king or clan. We see that during this time period, the Scots and the English along the border struggled to really develop towns or industries for the same reason that it's difficult to develop these advancements in violent regions of the world like Honduras, the Middle East, and Africa in the present day. The constant warlike conditions prevent infrastructure and industry from being sustainable. This kept the total population of Scotland well under 1 million into the 1500s. Most Scottish roads could not accommodate a horse-drawn carriage, and trade was usually done with bartering or with foreign currencies. The Scots also didn't manufacture their own weapons. Their spears, armor, and bows were all imported. And as you can probably deduce from that, skilled labor was basically unheard of. The main Scottish industries, or really lack thereof, consisted of raw materials such as salt, fish, coal, wool, skins, hides, etc. Another deduction that you can make from this is that education was severely lacking. Because of this, superstition was widespread, and there was allegedly no 14th century Scottish baron that could write his own name. Here we also see the first real pursuit of universal law. In the 14th century, a succession of Scottish kings tried to establish law which would inevitably move the Scots forward economically and culturally, but the main takeaway from this period is that they attempted to replace the basis of power from kinship to territory. So instead of rule being based on blood relationships, there were nobles that held land from the king in exchange for military service. This shifted the culture from being tribal to being feudalistic. This feudalism was introduced as Anglo-Norman nobles were given land grants by the crown. Before the end of the 15th century, they tended to speak English in the Scottish lowlands as opposed to Gaelic, and English wasn't actually adopted in the highlands until the 19th century. And their communities prospered because they introduced craft skills and commercial experience. Without fail, the beginnings of universal law faced resistance from the indigenous clans and the nobles, and the power of authority figures was not equally effective over Scotland for this very reason. It was, as you can guess, least effective in the Highlands, which maintained freedom and isolation. The lowlands received cultural influence from Scandinavians, the English, and continental Europeans. The Highlanders derived their livelihood from continuing to pillage, plunder, and raid lowland territories. One historian wrote that the Highlanders' greatest pleasure was stealing, and their second greatest pleasure was destruction. While I think that's superficially true, we'll soon get to the underlying theories as to why that is. Now, countryside Scots brought English farmers into their region to teach them agricultural methods, and while they didn't all translate over to the rocky Scottish terrain, there were many tools and practices that were adopted. Underlying this progression, there were power struggles between the Scandinavians, the Normans, the Highlanders, and the Lowlanders for various territories of Scotland. And then the advent of gunpowder and cannons helped to consolidate that power to Scottish and English kings, and it swung the balance of power in favor of royalty, which again helped to establish unified order. Now, I'm certainly more focused on the broad events that affected these societies long term, but one event that acted as a catalyst for centuries to come was the English capturing, sacking, and slaughtering in Berwick in the 14th century. This was so unimaginably brutal that it set in motion a retaliatory tit for tat in which the Scots responded with atrocities and brutality of their own. The English then responded to that, and the national battles truly began. This retrogressed the border region into a lawless frontier where feuding clans and marauders and vigilantes flourished. They would pledge allegiance as it was convenient, but they were specifically honorable towards no one. Uniting Scotland and England took place over many centuries, and many see the largest event as being the Scottish King James VI inheriting the English throne and becoming King James I of England. That happened in 1603. Now, that united the countries under one king, despite the countries still having separate parliaments and other political institutions. It took a little over a century, 1707 specifically, for the countries to be fully united under one parliament in London. This introduced the Scots to the economics, politics, culture, and trade that England had access to, which was the entire British Empire. Because of this, Scottish cities grew rapidly in the 18th century with massive improvements in industry and agriculture. The last major uprising in Scotland took place in 1745 in an attempt by the Highlanders to restore the Catholic Stuarts to the throne, but this was put down by loyalist Scots from the lowlands and the English. Over this time period, the Scottish population became more concentrated in the lowlands, and Anglicization began in the lowlands among the wealthy and the educated. By the mid-18th century, most Highlanders spoke little English, but as late as the early 19th century, Gaelic was still present. Once Highlanders adopted English uniformly in the 19th century, they could now access centuries of intellectual development in many fields, along with English translations of literary pieces 2,000 years old. The reason that this was so significant is not just that English was more widespread, but also that Gaelic was spoken but very rarely written. And by no means were Highlanders all of a sudden just reading classical works, but Scottish intellectuals couldn't help but be affected by other worldly ideas. This was the single largest change to Scottish sophistication since the 16th century change from Catholicism to Protestantism, which led to a Presbyterian church which created schools and promoted education on a national scale. Of course, as you can probably guess, due to the time period, it was a very narrow and superficial teaching, and it touched on none of the intellectuals of Europe. Then by the late 18th century, Scotland had the most extensive system of education in Europe, and this spread to all levels of society. This created a distinct class of intellectuals that dominated the world not only in quantity, but also in quality. Some examples are David Hume, Adam Ferguson, Francis Hutchinson, and Thomas Reid in philosophy. There was Adam Smith, James Mill, and John Stuart Mill in economics and political science. Chemistry had Joseph Black. Sociology had John Miller. Poetry had Robert Burns. And then there was Robert Adam, the architect, who influenced design in everything from palaces to book bindings. There was James Watt, who developed the steam engine. There was Sir Walter Scott, who was a world-class novelist. There was Thomas Carlyle, who was a historian and a bit of a philosopher. And Scotland also produced Britain's leading intellectual journal called the Edinburgh Review. But That's not all. Edinburgh University's medical faculty was established in 1726, and by the latter half of the 18th century, it was the leading medical school in Europe. Between 1726 and 1790, over 12,000 men had passed through, with dozens going to settle in Virginia and many others scattered throughout the American colonies. Graduates from the Edinburgh University Medical School also established the first American medical school in Philadelphia in 1765, and the King's College Medical School, which later became Columbia University's medical school, along with Dartmouth's medical school in 1798. Scottish physicians were also common in 18th century Russia, including the court physician to Catherine the Great, and a Scotsman was head of the medical chancery at St. Petersburg. Now, between the mid-18th century and mid-19th century, we see a disproportionate share of leading English intellectuals that were either Scottish or of Scottish ancestry. Now, virtually all of the leading intellectuals were from the Scottish lowlands, and neither the poor nor the aristocracy was well represented. The Scots also made little to no impact as playwrights or musicians. The Scottish people were one that paid it forward from a cultural standpoint. They suffered as a people at the hands of their own inability to wield the instincts and ideas that possessed them. This kept them from upgrading their standard of living, but the suffering that they have brought upon themselves with their own hostility, lack of trust, and untamed and ferocious nature forced them to shape in a much more well-defined and functional way. This meant that once these selfish and powerful traits became understood and their energy was pointed in the proper direction, they adopted and understood a belief in the importance of society and networking, which for those days consisted of alliances, trading, and really a unified culture. In order for the Scots to begin opening themselves to the British Empire, there was a hurdle to overcome. They managed to unite the deity resembling their nation with their most common enemy. This was the Scottish King James VI inheriting the throne of England to become King James I of England, and this united the nations under one king, but the Scots and the English, like I said before, retained separate parliaments and other various political institutions. This is not something that could have happened at just any time in Scottish history, as it had to specifically happen after the Scottish people had gradually come to see the importance of a cohesive society. Now, to examine this development properly, we need to start with the root of environmental stresses that developed their culture. To start with their diets, the Scots were known for their incredible size, health, endurance, and vitality, as well as prowess in battle. While most Europeans at the time were eating a diet based on grains and vegetables, although not exclusively of course, the Scots, more so the Highlanders but also the Lowlanders, were eating animal foods like raw milk, sheep, goats, cows, cheese, and butter. This is where haggis came from. It's sheep or calf organs mixed with suet, oatmeal, seasoning, and then traditionally boiled in the animal's stomach. The main fruit was berries when they were in season, and the only grains that could be grown were barley and oats. Blood pudding also developed because the quantity of milk that could be acquired from the cows fluctuated greatly based on the food available to the cattle. The Scots would consume blood when there was a shortage of milk. Now, having a variable diet was fairly common across people who lived in variable climates, such as the Scots, the English, the French, the Germans, all to different degrees. But the way that the Scottish diet differed was that they did not have access to the vast array of foods that the other cultures had access to. And so their diet remained extremely personal and disproportionate because it was grown, preserved, and cooked mostly within Scotland due to the lack of trade. But despite the fluctuation of the seasons, it still remained far more animal-based than other Europeans. Most other Europeans would eat vegetables and fruits in the late spring and summer, but even during these periods, the Scots consumed mostly animal products. Now, to get anything useful out of life, we have to feel as if we know what it's all about. And we do this by taking what is most proximal to us and applying it to our external experiences. A good example is that we only know how to digest ideas because we digest food. And Scots' weighted diet meant that they had a far more unbalanced digestion, and this helped to produce a culture ultimately separate from those around them with more balanced, yet less uniform diets. Now, while I certainly wouldn't say that diet is the only influence on culture, I would say that it produced a noticeable prejudice that wasn't able to be quelled until the English influence seeped in and began affecting the diets of lowlanders and then eventually the highlanders. So while the transition to Scottish and English unity took a long time, the digestive system ingrained in the Scottish people residually influenced their culture long after unification. And just to make my point here more simply, the Scottish diet, while not enacting the entire stomach in the digestive process, was more consistent, and this allowed the instincts born out of that digestion to inflate far beyond their other European counterparts. Once they were unified with England, their diet became more varied, meaning that they could now enact more of the stomach in the process of digestion, and thus more of the brain in the process of thought. But the instincts that were heightened by the poorly weighted Scottish diet continued to retain their strength for centuries. This longevity is not seen in other cultures, and so to assume that diet was everything would be far too superficial. The next factor to consider after diet is climate. The climate was not always as it is now. During the Middle Ages and medieval times, there are records of vineyards as far north as northern Scotland, although the colder seasons were still brutal for both the English and the Scots, and the humidity was fairly similar. This is where it's important to note that while climate might not be a major factor in explaining the differences between the Scots and the English, it is certainly a larger factor in explaining the differences between the British, so the Scots and the English, and the continental Europeans. Humidity slows down the organic functions, and this is why dry places like Athens, Jerusalem, Florence, and Paris have cultivated such genius. The organic functions are more rapid and thus, when properly directed, more productive. Not to mention that Scotland and England grew somewhat colder since the Middle Ages, so the air can hold less moisture as they were approaching the Enlightenment. I also recognize that a lot of what I'm saying here might sound rather foreign to people, so let me just quickly summarize what I've been saying about Scotland up to this point. The diet affects how ideas are digested and what instincts are born out of this digestion. The diet was heavily weighted to one side, and so the cultivation of instincts was also heavily weighted. The climate, while by no means ideal for intellectuals, became more conducive to intellectuals from the Middle Ages into the Enlightenment because the climate affects the speed of organic functions. And so, while a dry climate leaves one's thoughts unimpeded, a humid climate serves to cloud them by slowing down the organic functions. Again, this could be a stress that helped to shape the Scots into a functional people. For these factors, you can think of culture as a forest. Rather than the Scots having a forest of equal height, some of their trees are low to the ground and some are up in the clouds. As they began to have outside influence, the smaller trees began to grow, while the taller trees only shrank minimally. As with anything, there is a cost for every gain. Now, the English were similar in the sense that they initially had a disproportionate forest, much like the Scots, except their trees began being leveled much sooner due to their geography and more temperate climate relative to the Scots, even though it's very slightly more temperate. I wouldn't say that England's tallest trees ever grew as tall as the Scots though, but the quality of a forest is judged by height, density, and life that's found there, much like people and societies are judged by their strengths and their weaknesses. So to just say that the Scots had the tallest trees doesn't necessarily mean that they were just the best, but it also matters how these different trees in the forest are relative to each other, much like how the different traits in a person are relative to each other. You can't have an extremely disproportionate person and call them functional. You can't do it. Now, I mentioned in the previous section of this video how the Scots were geographically and culturally isolated from the rest of the world, and this alone meant that they were allowed to stew in their own pot for a longer period of time. The instincts that had been cultivated were allowed to solidify much more than other geographically connected regions of the world. These instincts were necessarily ones of self-preservation, selfishness, self-interest, and power by any means necessary. The stronger and more disproportionately weighted these instincts become, the more intoxicating they are, and thus they are more difficult to understand and grasp. So it took longer for the Scots to harness an understanding of how to effectively apply their instincts to social cohesion because their instincts were so much more powerful. Again though, this is born out of their geographical location. Their assimilation was expressed in the gradual process of unification with England, and eventually the rest of the world, although it should not go without saying that pre-Roman Britain was remarkably similar to Scotland at the time. But between Roman rule and proximity to mainland Europe, the Brits were able to build a dominant empire as opposed to a dominant person. This was both a strength and a weakness in separate regards. Now, once the Scots had entered a period of self-discovery as it pertained to ordering and directing their instincts in a more sophisticated way, the structure was basically handed to them by the rest of the world possessing weaker instincts that are more easily confined to law and order. Luckily, the most proximal influence was the English, who were not terribly different from the Scots relative to the rest of the world. The weaker instincts to power that the rest of the world possessed allowed more of the individual's brutish self-interest to be sacrificed in order to attain long-term social bonds, and thus they were more conducive to social cohesion. So, the Scots willingly being introduced to the English has been a landmark shift in the Scottish people, as the people who had been formed under the harshest conditions and carved with the most remarkable detail from the hardest wood, suddenly had the full breadth of their powerful instincts properly channeled. Now, when it comes to something like the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, it's important to note that these events occurred over the Western world. It wasn't specifically Scotland, and so the timing of Scotland opening to the rest of the British Empire was crucial. Just to nail down some years here, the Enlightenment was roughly from 1685 to 1815, and the Industrial Revolution was roughly from 1780 to 1840. The lowland Scots spent a few centuries leading up to this with loose ties to English culture, and in 1603, like I said before, they united under King James, and in 1707, they united under Parliament. This allowed the Scots to keep their aggressive, adaptable, and selfish instincts intact, while also channeling it properly right at the moment that the rest of the world was calling on intellectual developments. It can hardly be said that the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution were led by those who stuck to rigid structures and old methods. Here we see Scottish adaptability and ingenuity rise out of their physiology and into the external world, while also being channeled properly because of the surrounding order. Now, it makes sense here to raise the question of why the Highland Scots, who remained in the Scottish echo chamber longer than the Lowlanders, were not as prominent in these intellectual fields. And again, I raise the factor of timing. The chain of influence that began with the British Empire traveled first to the Lowlanders and then to the Highlanders from the Lowlanders. This means that if the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution were pushed off long enough for the Lowlanders to maximally channel their instincts and then begin the process of dilution, and the Highlanders were able to channel their instincts properly, we would likely see far more Highlanders represented in the intellectual advancements. Of course, this is not historically practical, as it would require multiple other cultures to be held back, but from an isolated theoretical standpoint, it would logically follow. So, just to reiterate, the reason that the Lowlanders were disproportionately represented among Scottish intellectuals is because of timing and the chain of influence. Now, when you look at the academic fields that the Scots excelled in, it's an indication that the lack of societal order in their history served to preserve their ability to discover new terrain and think outside of the Overton window that government and cohesive societies inextricably cultivate. With the Scots' history of rulers but no solid body of law, we see the Scots as a people. They were not constrained in a unified way. This means that they could not be ground down in any way that would not serve to strengthen them in the long run. What I mean by this is that when a society has unified order imposed on it, the culture is shaped in specific ways because the tactics used to weaken people and get them to obey that order are uniformly applied to the entire culture, thus weakening the entire culture. The Scots did not experience that unified order, and thus they were given small cuts that could heal and serve to empower them, as opposed to losing entire limbs and suffering tragic losses to their instincts of individuality and self-preservation. It's like one person getting 1,000 cuts versus 1,000 people getting one cut. The turnover of any semblance of order in Scottish history is too great to cut the culture deep in one way. So every single cut is able to heal, propelling them to grow stronger from what doesn't kill them. This type of environment also gets the Scots to understand in manageable doses how power is intoxicating and corrupting, and this has been burned into them. What I'm describing can be seen to a much lesser degree in those who left England for America. Now, much like in America, the Scottish began to live under the societal safety net brought forward by government, and they've slowly forgotten over a couple centuries exactly what allowed them to attain the great strength that they once possessed as a people. While that doesn't mean that there aren't still Scots, or Americans for that matter, that love unbridled freedom, it can't be ignored that Scotland had the smallest percentage of people that said that they wanted to leave the EU during the Brexit vote in 2016. It was only about 38% that wanted to leave. The problem that government imposes on a strong people is that it allows people to revert to the jungle mindset where wealth is a zero-sum game. People are allowed to take from others by brute force as opposed to voluntary interactions that can benefit both parties. The primary difference between leaders and rulers is that the leader's orders must be voluntarily accepted, while the rulers can be forcefully imposed. There's also a difference among natural incentives and man-made incentives. In both cases, death is a strong incentive, but in one, the stress is being applied equally by uniform nature. In the other, the stress is being applied unequally by subjective man. Natural stresses shape people into functioning human beings. Man-made stresses serve to weaken man and make him ill. There is a massive difference between a man doing something out of his own self-interest and a man doing something because he was commanded to do it. One resembles strength, the other resembles weakness. Government only commands. Another point to not be lost here is that it seems as if once military technology advanced, a few of the most politically connected people were able to monopolize power. This does not make the case for government, but rather it makes the case for a unified culture. This was something that the Scots did not have a solid grasp of simply because it predated their ability to understand the necessity of social cohesion. So they were still fractured into clans, tribes, and vigilantes. A similar argument for government can be made by looking at the superior long-term plans of authoritarian countries like China, Russia, and Iran. Yet again, I see this as a call for a unified culture, not a call for authoritarianism. There is nothing necessarily tying unity to government. I simply believe that there hasn't been a culture in the modern age strong enough to produce an anarcho-capitalist society. And although the Scots had the strength, they've since lost it. And with governments wearing down people's ability to find their own advantage in life, it seems like we're farther from achieving this than ever before. It's a massive mental hurdle to have a unified culture, but also realize you do not need government. Is it possible? Yes, but it's not intuitive. And with a strong culture, there's no reason to remember how that strength was attained. So there will be, without a doubt, a return to the belief that government is a necessity. Government is social control, and as democracy is allowed to erode a unified government, it stems from an eroded people. In authoritarian countries, the people are still eroded, but the government is not affected as heavily. This turns those who live under authoritarianism into tamed beasts in the end, but beasts nonetheless. Meanwhile, the beast in the West is nowhere to be found. We traded our wings for horns long ago, despite the widely held belief that we did the exact opposite. Again, it's not a call for authoritarianism. In fact, it's quite the contrary. It's a call for a strong, unified culture. Now, when it comes to the middle-aged Scots, I would not call it a functioning anarchist nation at any point in history. They had what was essentially cultural anarchy by necessity. Their instincts wouldn't allow anything else, and it couldn't have been any other way. Their powerful instincts repelled those who sacrificed impulsive desires for social cohesion because the Scots would take everything from them without recognizing that the Scots themselves would be better off behaving in a cooperative and voluntary manner long term. So while I wouldn't say that Scotland was an example of functioning anarchy, it does give us some very deep insights into human nature, anarchist theory, and cultural development as a whole. I really hope that you enjoyed this extended and expansive breakdown of Scottish history. If you made it all the way to the end, I thank you tremendously. If you'd like more videos like this in the future, be sure to let me know by subscribing if you haven't, and by leaving a comment. I mean, I recognize that in this video, there's a lot that I capture. It's easy to miss a connection or to have questions that spring up. Outside of the objective history, almost everything else that I've said is fairly original philosophical work, especially on the Scots. So, of course, I'm always trying to refine my thoughts on these matters. If you think that there's anything that you can contribute, I'd be glad to read it in the comments. I thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.